So a couple days ago in the Toronto Star, a columnist named Bob Hepburn published an article taking down electoral reform, offering 6 arguments for why a proportional system would be bad news for Canada, why it wouldn't solve issues, and why it might even create worse issues for the country. And I, unsurprisingly, disagree with this argument by Bob Hepburn, and I want to offer my disagreements in this video. And it's not really so much about Mr. Hepburn and the Toronto Star for publishing this piece, because these arguments are extremely common ones. So I want to offer this video to people also as a tool to help respond to arguments that are commonly made against proportional representation. This isn't just for the Canadian context. This could also be used in many other countries as well that are dealing with first past the post and all the problems that that system brings. So Mr. Hepburn's first argument is that it will lead to political chaos, that many of the countries in the world that are known for political gridlock and chaos, like Italy and Israel, have a proportional system, and that he argues that Canada would face the same challenges if we adopted it. And he notes that there are more stable countries like Sweden and Germany that have proportional systems, but that they aren't necessarily better off than Canada. So this goes to a traditional argument that a lot of anti-electoral reform voices use, which is that Canada is one of the greatest countries in the world, and we have first past the post, so why are we trying to fix something that ain't broke? But that's really problematic, because with all of these countries, there are literally thousands of factors for why a democratic system might be more or less functional. And electoral reform is very important, but it's just one variable. And so when you look at Italy and you look at Israel, and say proportional representation creates political instability and gridlock, and then you look at Germany and Sweden and say that proportional representation there doesn't cause those issues, well, what we're looking at then is that proportional representation isn't necessarily the one and only thing that determines the stability of a country. And rather, this goes to a more philosophical debate. Is the point of government just to have good, stable government, or is it to reflect the will of the electorate? Because you could argue for dictatorship if you believe the first one. If you believe that a good, stable government comes from less democracy, then you don't need democracy. If good, stable government is the raison d'etre of your state, of your polity, then democracy is not even a consideration. Now, I'm not suggesting that Mr. Hepburn is making that argument. He isn't. But what I am saying is that if you don't count factor 2, then you really aren't lending yourself towards a system that respects order and democracy. And I would argue that while first past the post can be linked to stability, it also has the same risks of fragmentation on regional and ideological bases. Look at Canada right now, where many people feel alienated from the result and where the governing party nearly won a majority with 1/3 of the vote. That's not stability. That's not cooperation across regions and ideologies. And so some might argue that first past the post right now, at least, neither offers stability nor does it offer a representation of the will of Canadians. Proportionality may in some cases, in some countries with underlying issues, not solve the problem of instability, but it's not inherent. As Mr. Hepburn notes, there are countries like Sweden and Germany that have great stability and that are comparable in Canada in terms of quality societies. They're some of the best societies in the world to live. And those people in those countries have a better representation of their will. The electorate has a better representation of what they believe. We do not have that in Canada. And so my counter to this is that a stable country like Canada, a wealthy country like Canada, a tolerant and diverse country like Canada, can both have the stability of government and the representation of will, but that's only possible to have both with some element of proportionality. Mr. Hepburn's second argument is that this would lead to perpetual minority governments. That in the post-World War II era in Canada, it's extremely rare to have any one party at the federal level win more than 50% of the vote, meaning that if there was proportionality, there'd be very, very, very few majority governments. And he says that's a bad thing because minority governments lead to gridlock and they lead to secret backroom deals and they lead to instability. And again, we can leave instability aside because we've sort of talked about that. But in terms of this being a bad thing, why is it a bad thing that the governments reflect the will of the people? If Canadians rarely give one party majority support, then parties should rarely have majority power. It should be hypothetically possible, of course, if Justin Trudeau or Andrew Scheer or Jagmeet Singh was able to get 53% of the vote, then they should get roughly 53% of the seats, and with that gain majority power. And that would be democratic. There are some provincial governments in this country who do from time to time win over 50% of the support and justify a majority government even if we had proportionality. But it should be rare at a federal level when there are 5 or 6 parties. That shouldn't be common for one party to have all that power. And so what he sees as dangerous because it would, cause gridlock, I see as an accurate reflection of the will of the people, making majority governments the extreme rarity that they should be. But beyond this, he has this fear of backroom deals, leaving out the populace. But let's be 100% real. Right now, we're in a minority government situation, and those deals he fears under proportionality might still happen because this minority government, formed under first past the post, will require cooperation, at least from time to time, between the governing Liberals and some form of the opposition. On an issue-by-issue basis, or with some parties more than others, Trudeau will have to make deals with those party leaders, and some of those deals will be formulated in back rooms. But further to all that, in majority governments, the decisions are all made in the back room, folks. It's called cabinet. Cabinet is the back room. And in a majority government, the average Liberal MP doesn't really have all that much of a say. Justin Trudeau, his key non-elected advisors, and his cabinet ministers effectively make all the decisions. And that, yes, technically his party could rebel against him, but that is such a rarity in Canadian politics that it basically can be discounted. Under a first past the post system where 35% can get you a majority, which is 100% of the power, the deals are still made in the back room, but by only one party representing as little as a third of the population. That is far, far less democratic and far, far, far more secretive than if multiple parties in an open way had to negotiate to make deals. And yes, while in the formulative process, some of those discussions might happen behind closed doors, it is much more accountable and much more transparent than the current system of cabinet secrecy that exists under an unrepresentative first past the post system. The backroom deals still happen. And let's also be clear that this vision of first past the post, meaning that the people get what they want and the backroom deals don't apply, that is BS. Because don't forget, Doug Ford won a majority government under first past the post, and many of the things that he has done have been in direct discordance with what he ran on. He didn't even talk about, taking away council seats in Toronto. He said not one single public servant will lose their job, and that was a lie. And those decisions were not made with consultation from the public. They were made in the back rooms of the Ontario PC parties, likely with minimal actual input from rank and file Ontario PC MPPs, and almost entirely from Doug Ford's core team, including non-elected party staffers. The third argument raised is that this could allow dangerous fringe groups to get into Parliament, and that he says progressives want more representation, but do they really want to see an anti-choice party? Or do they really want to see a gun rights party? Or do they want to see more regionalism? Do they want a Wexit party or a maritime rights party? And on and on and on and on. And this is an argument that Justin Trudeau actually made when he broke his promise, that he didn't want to empower dangerous groups. But first of all, there's a couple counterpoints to be made here. Proportional systems can and often do include minimum thresholds. And by that I mean you need to get a minimum amount of popular support to actually get seats in the parliament under proportional allocation. Put another way, if you have a parliament of 100 seats, then to get one seat, you would need 1% of the vote. If you got 3%, you would get 3 seats. But the system might argue, to stop the smallest of fringe parties from winning seats, that you need to get a minimum of 5%. And if you can't get more than 5, then you don't get anything. And under that regulation, the most fringe of the fringe wouldn't get seats. And as much as I dislike it, there might be some fringe parties, quote unquote fringe parties, that could get more than 5 or 6 or 7% of the vote. And guys, I have to say that as much as we dislike it, if you can consistently get 5% support in a federal general election, then maybe your views aren't as fringe as people would like to think, and maybe you deserve representation in parliament. That's democracy. That's a reflection of the will of the people. And this fear that these parties could hold the balance of power, while hypothetically true, it's not necessarily the case. First of all, there's always going to be 2 or 3 or 4 larger, more mainstream parties. Consider that the Liberals, NDP, Greens, and Conservatives would likely all carry the majority of seats even under a proportional system. And the seats would be more evenly distributed between those parties, but that those parties would form the likely majority of all the deals. And this fear that the Conservatives would be held hostage by 2 or 3 of these fringe parties isn't necessarily likely, because let's be real, the Conservatives could always cooperate with the Liberals to form a grand, anti-extremist coalition. And so all of these options are on the table. The fourth argument is that a proportional system would allow parties to directly appoint MPs, and that would just allow the back rooms more power over the rank and file voters. But again, that's not necessarily true. First, there's a proportional system called the single transferable vote, which basically creates multi-member ridings and distributes seats within those ridings on a proportional basis, but everyone in those ridings is actually running. None of them are appointed officials directly to Parliament by the parties. People still have to earn the votes in the ridings. And even under mixed member proportional, which includes a mixture of the first past the post system along with proportional allocation, can be made with an open list. And what that basically means is that your first vote goes to your local MP, as it always did. Your second vote goes to a party, but you get to pick who from that party gets your vote from your region. And everybody on that list is running for a seat in your region. So let's say your region is 14 seats big. You get your local vote, and then you get to pick any one of the 14 people, but from the party of your choice. So if the NDP gets a proportional seat, the Jagmeet Singh and the party leadership don't get to determine who gets first crack at that proportional seat. The voters do, and that's crucial. And we have to also be really clear here, guys. Under our current system, the party leaders, Justin Trudeau, Jagmeet Singh, Andrew Scheer, Elizabeth May, all the rest, they have immense amount of power over who gets to run for their parties right now. Under the current system, it's often the case that the local candidate is chosen by the local membership, but candidates can be denied from running based on their personal history, based on criminal conduct, based on their views, based on what they've said in the past, based on any matter of factors. And that happens to all political parties. Every party is involved in that to some degree. And in some cases, parties directly place candidates in certain ridings with very, very minimal, if any, approval from the actual activists in that community. And so the parties still get to determine these things. And so when you combine that with the fact that very few independents actually win any seats, you could have a riding where every candidate was directly chosen by the party leadership, effectively meaning that no matter who you vote for, you're voting for a backroom boy or a backroom girl. That doesn't always happen, but it can happen under first past the post. The next argument from Hepburn is that if you adopt proportionality, you likely need to make ridings bigger, or you need to add more politicians in Ottawa. And he sees both of those options as wrong. But I have to say that that's extremely short-sighted. If you actually do believe that adding a few politicians is the bane of our democracy because you'll have more people, I don't see it as a functional argument that a few more politicians is a bad thing. It's more voices that could potentially represent the diversity of views and of demography of our country. And that's never a bad thing. And if you're dead set against more politicians, then having ridings become slightly bigger isn't a death knell either. I understand the concern that if you live in an already large riding, you might have, an aversion to a slightly bigger riding where, you'll be a little bit further away from your member of parliament. But in either case, the system will better reflect the will of voters. And while having a few more politicians or a slightly bigger riding is less than ideal for some people, although I feel more politicians is not a bad thing, although I can see the downside to larger ridings, None of that is so bad that it actually outweighs the good that a more accurate representation of the people offers. And we have to also be really clear. Under our current system, often your MP, if they're from a different party, might not be amenable to the issues you care about. Under multi-member districts, if you have single transferable vote, you're more likely to have MPs from multiple parties representing you, meaning that you can go to those people and find different levels of support based on different issues. And you might even have some competition to see who could best represent you. And maybe MPs will work harder to represent their constituents if there's somebody who's trying to one-up them on that game. And under a system of mixed member proportional, you'll have your one dedicated riding MP, same as now. The riding might be bigger, but you'll have one dedicated riding MP, but then you'll have multiple regional MPs representing more accurately the diversity of your region. And so even there, you'll have your local guy or gal, and then you'll have multiple regional guys or gals, and they will be willing to support you based on your needs and your constituency. And if your local person isn't doing their job because they're lazy or because ideologically they don't want to help you with your concern, you'll be able to find someone much more likely who will do that work. So more representation in terms of who could help you and more diversity in the types of representation you could get makes it a far better system than the current one we have in terms of access to your member of parliament. And finally, Hepburn makes the point that this won't do anything to increase voter turnout. And he notes that in general, whether under first past the post or proportional representation, turnout has been long in decline in Western democracies, and it saw a recent uptick. And he says that there's no real difference. But I think that's a bit of a misleading argument, because there's been some data collected by Fair Vote Canada, who should be noted as a supporter of electoral reform. But the data they've collected has shown that Canada has a lower turnout than the OECD average, and that all the countries above the average have some element of proportionality. That first past the post generally does have lower turnout. And they cite some studies that show that specifically with young people, turnout is higher in systems of proportionality. But let's just say that proportional systems don't raise turnout. What they will do, though, is raise the voter satisfaction. Even today, among people who vote, they go to the polls with deep cynicism. If you live in a riding that votes 80% liberal or 80% conservative, effectively you know your vote is meaningless. Even if you support that party at 80%. You know your vote doesn't really mean much. Whether a rural Alberta conservative wins with 72 or 76 or 79% of the vote, it's literally meaningless. It doesn't matter if you vote for the other parties, and it doesn't matter if you vote for that party. Your vote doesn't count. If you vote for very small parties, your vote doesn't count. If you end up voting even in a riding where your party wins only by, say, 3,000 votes, well then 2,999 people's votes didn't count. It's a broken system, and Canadians know that, and people under first past the post know that in many parts of the country, based on who you support or who you don't support, your vote does not matter. People still go out and vote because they believe it's important, and they're right. You should still go and vote no matter what. But don't you think that turnout could rise if people had a basic understanding that their vote was extremely likely to count? That if you go vote NDP in rural Alberta, you're like, look, under a proportional system, my local MP is still going to be a conservative. But if the NDP can get 5% in regional numbers, then I will get one seat representing me from the NDP. So I'm going to go out and make sure to vote for my party no matter what, because we'll get something from it. The local MP will still be a conservative. This is a true blue area of my region, or this is a true red area of my region, no matter what. But I deserve some representation in some way, and I can only get that if I vote, and I'll get that proportionally. I really do believe that will raise turnout in Canada, that will reduce cynicism in voting, and that will let people know that more than ever before, their vote will count. Right? Of course, no system is perfect. If you end up voting for a really small party and they don't meet the threshold, then your vote will be wasted. But this system will much better ensure that there are far fewer votes wasted in any sort of riding, close ridings and blowout ridings. So those were Hepburn's 6 arguments in the Toronto Star, and they are extremely common ones. Those are among the most 6 common arguments you will hear levied against proportional systems or electoral reform more generally. And I have to say that I found none of the 6 convincing, and I do hope that you found my counter arguments at least somewhat convincing. If you found this video useful, let me know in the comments, and do share it around. Share these arguments around, share this video around, because if we're going to really win proportional representation, we have to cut through the misinformation. And the only way we can counter it is through proper information about how proportionality can preserve the good things about our current system and add a whole bunch of new things to make our democracy more responsive, more reflective, more collaborative, and more positive. That's what's at stake. We can do that, guys, if we work together and share the information in this video.